Hi, everybody. It's Professor Mitchell. We are continuing with Chapter 6 on ratio, proportion, and percent. And today we're talking about percents, decimals, and fractions. In this section, we're going to understand percent, write percents as decimals or fractions, and then go the other way, write decimals or fractions as percents, and finally solve applications with percents, decimals, and fractions. So the word percent means per 100. It's a Latin word. And this symbol, the percent symbol, is used to denote percent. So in this picture, you see 48 squares out of 100 that are shaded, which means 48% of the squares are shaded. 48% means 48% means 48 out of 100. Okay. All right, so if there are 100 parrots and 58 are female, what percent of the parrots are female? Well, since the total is 100, that makes this a pretty easy problem. It would be 58% because, again, 58 out of 100 means 58%. Similarly, if 31 out of 100 instructors are in their 40s, what percent of instructors are in their 40s? Well, again, because it's out of 100, that makes this really easy. It would be 31%. All right, so the first kind of conversion we're going to talk about is writing a percent as a decimal. So when you want to change a percent into a decimal, replace the percent symbol with its decimal equivalent 1/100th. Remember, percent means per 100. So it kind of makes sense that the percent symbol would have the same meaning as 1/100th. So for example, if you wanted to change 43% into a decimal, you would replace the percent symbol with 1/100th. And then remember from the last chapter, when you multiply a number by 1/100th, all you have to do is move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So it starts off after the 3, you go 1, 2, it ends up right before the 4. All right, so the examples should be pretty simple. They all kind of work the same. Okay, if you want to change 49% into a decimal, replace the percent sign with the decimal 1/100th, and then multiply by moving the decimal point 2 places to the left. Just be careful when your percentage starts off with the decimal point in a different place. 3 8/10%. We're going to replace the percent sign with 1/100th. The decimal point is going to move 2 places to the left, 1, and then it has to go 1 more, which means we're going to insert a 0 right before the 3, and the decimal point is over that 0. 185%. Sometimes percentages over 100 do make sense. So 185%, we would multiply 185 by 1/100th. The decimal point starts off after the 5. It's going to move 1, 2 places to be between the 1 and the 8. You can also have very small percentages. This percentage is less than 1%, 69/100ths of a percent. So to change that into a decimal, replace the percent sign with 1/100th. The decimal point is going to go 1, 2. So there's going to be 2 zeros between the decimal point and the 6. So as a decimal, 69/100ths of 1% is equivalent to 69 10,000ths. All right, writing a percent as a fraction. So that's actually very similar to what we were just doing. The only difference is that instead of replacing the percent sign with the decimal 1/100th, you replace it with the fraction 1/100th. And I guess it couldn't hurt to point out or remind you that when you multiply a whole number by a fraction, you can think of there being a 1 underneath the whole number. So then you go 7 times 1 is 7, 1 times 100 is 100. All right, so in these examples, we're going to write each percent as a fraction, and then we almost always have to simplify the fractions. So if we have 60%, we're going to take away that percent sign, replace it with the fraction 1/100th. 60 times 1/100th is 60 over 100. That fraction can be simplified because 60 and 100 have a common factor 20. Take out the common factor and you're left with 3/5. So 60% is equivalent to 3/5. 1 4/10%, this one is a little more complicated because the percent is a decimal. We're going to start off the same way by replacing the percent sign with the fraction 1/100th. So that gives us 1 4/10 over 100. I think we've seen an example like this once before. When you have a decimal inside a fraction, that is not considered simplified. So the first thing we're going to do to clean that up is to multiply the top and the bottom of the fraction by 10. And the reason we're doing by 10 is because that will move this decimal point one place to the right. 1 4/10 times 10 is 14. 100 times 10 is 1,000. So that looks a little nicer. It's just not in simplest form because 14 and 1,000 have a common factor 2. So we're going to write 14 as 2 times 7, write 1,000 as 2 times 500. Take out the common factor 2. We're left with 7/500ths. All right, same kind of examples. Might not be a bad idea for you to pause the video and try at least a couple of these. 150%, we're going to take away the percent sign, replace it with 1/100th. That gives us 150 over 100, which is not in simplest form because they have a common factor 50. Take out the common factor, we're left with 3/2. So 1 1/2 would also be an okay answer for this because, well, the directions do say as a fraction or mixed number. If you're doing online homework, just remember to read the directions on the online homework because sometimes they really want an improper fraction, sometimes they really want a mixed number. Okay, now letter B here is a little, it's a little different. Starts off the same way, replace the percent sign with 1/100th. Now remember to multiply mixed numbers or to multiply a mixed number by a fraction, you have to rewrite the mixed number as an improper fraction. So we're going to go 66 times 3 is 198. 198 times plus 2 is 200. So that becomes 200 over 3 times 1 over 100. And I think they got a little lazy because instead of writing the 200 as 2 times 100, they just did it this way that I've asked you not to do, right? I don't take points off if you do it correctly, but I'm a little stingier on partial credit if you do that and do it incorrectly. Okay. So that leaves us with 2/3. 66 and 2/3% is the same thing as 2/3. And finally, 12%. I think this is almost exactly like what we were doing on the previous slide. Hopefully you did this one. That would be 12 over 100, but 12 and 100 have a common factor 4. So we're going to take that out, take out the 4. We're left with 3/25. All right, now we're going to go the other way. So I want to point out that the two things that we just went over, writing a percent as a decimal and then writing a percent as a fraction, those both go into the category of changing a percent to something that's not a percent. And what those two things have in common is you start off with a percent sign and you get rid of it by replacing it with 1/100th, either in decimal form or fraction form. Now we're going the other way. We're changing something that's not a percent into a percent. So we're starting with something that does not have a percent sign, and we need to pick up the percent sign. So the way that you do that, no matter whether you're writing a decimal or a fraction as a percent, is to multiply by 1 in the form of 100%. 100% is another name for 1. It means 100 per 100, so that would be 1 whole. So, for example, if you start with the decimal 27/100ths, multiply that by 100%, which is a form of 1. And remember that when you multiply by 100, it moves the decimal point 2 places to the right. So 27/100ths is the same as 27%. All right, these examples should go pretty quick. Right, each decimal is a percent. Just multiply every single one of them by 100%. And that's going to move the decimal point 2 places to the right. I do recommend, the way that some people deal with changing percents to decimals or changing decimals as percents is they've memorized a rule that says sometimes you move the decimal point 2 to the left and sometimes you move it 2 to the right. I really prefer thinking of it as if you start with a percent sign, take it out, replace it with 1/100th. If you don't start with a percent sign, multiply by 100%. I think that's easier to remember because otherwise, you know, sometimes you move it 2 to the left, sometimes you move it 2 to the right. You might have trouble remembering when do I move it to the left and when do I move it to the right. If you do it this way, I don't think you'll have that problem. 1 46/100ths as a percent multiplied by 100% moves the decimal point 2 places to the right, 146%. 900ths would be 9%. 7/10ths, be careful with this one. Again, it moves the decimal point 2 places to the right. So first to the 7 and then another place, which means I need to tack on a 0. And finally, 61/1000ths. We're going to be multiplying this by 100%. Move the decimal point 1, 2 places to the right. It's going to end up at 6 1/10%. All right, similarly, to write a fraction as a percent, you do the exact same thing. You multiply by 1 in the form of 100%. So for example, 1/8, I'm going to multiply 1/8 by 100%. Notice that I'm keeping the percent sign in every single step of this. 1/8 times 100/1 is 100/8. And they've skipped a few steps here. I'm going to ask you maybe to pause the video and make sure that you're able to get from 100/8 to 12.5. You would simplify the fraction and then change into a mixed number. So 1/8, the fraction 1/8 is equivalent to 12.5%, which can also be written as 12 5/10%. All right, so we have a couple of fractions here. We're going to write them as percent, starting with 3/20. 3/20 is the same thing as 3/20 times 100%. So we do 3/20 times 100/1, which you can do this way, or I'm going to break my own rule here. The other way you can do it is say These two have a common factor 20. 20 divided by 20 is 1. 100 divided by 20 is 5. And that would get you directly to 15% because 3 times 5 is 15. And 1 times 1 is 1. So 15 over 1. 1 3/4%. I'm sorry, 1 3/4. It's not a percent. That's really important. Okay, so first we would change that 1 3/4 to an improper fraction, 7/4. And then we would go 7/4 times 100 over 1. And again, I would probably do it like this instead of the way they did it. So 4 and 100 are both divisible by 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 100 divided by 4 is 25. 7 times 25 is 175. So 1 3/4 as a percent is 175%. All right, so to summarize, and again, I kind of think of there just being two situations. To write something that is a percent as not a percent, meaning either a decimal or a fraction, replace the percent symbol with 1/100th, all right? And if you're trying to get a decimal, you use the decimal form of 1/100th. If you're trying to get a fraction, you use the fraction form. And to write either a decimal or a fraction, in other words, something that's not a percent, as a percent, multiply by 100%. All right, 67% of American men are happy with their current weight. They want us to convert this percent to a decimal. Okay, so I'm starting with a percent and I'm trying to make it not a percent. So this is where you take the percent sign, replace it with 1/100th, and because I'm trying to get a decimal, I'm going to use this form of 1/100th. And again, when you multiply by 1/100th, that moves the decimal point 2 places to the left. So as a decimal, this would be 67/100ths. As a fraction, we would use the fraction form of 1/100th. So that would be 67/100ths, which is already in simplest form. All right, an advertisement for a stereo system reads 1/5 off. What percent off is that? All right, so 1/5 is not a percent, and they want me to make it a percent. So this is the situation where I multiply by 100%. I'm trying to pick up the percent sign. So 1/5 times 100% is 100 divided by 5. 100 divided by 5 is 20. So 1/5 off is another way of saying 20% off. And that's the end of this section.